All right, so let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doing Chinese History in a New Era. This is the third and last in a series of 3 webinars organized by myself, Emily Baum at UC Irvine, and Denise Ho at Yale University. And even though this is our last webinar for this summer, we are planning to continue this series next summer with new topics and new speakers, so be on the lookout for information about that. This webinar has been generously sponsored by the Long U.S.-China Institute at UC Irvine and the Council on East Asian Studies at Yale University. We are also grateful to our very generous co-sponsors, Harvard University's Fairbanks Center, East Asian Studies at Johns Hopkins University, the Department of History at Simon Fraser University, the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Chicago, the Department of History at the University of Washington, and the Center for Asian Research at York University. So in this session, we'll be focusing on the topic of thinking outside the archive. And this topic was stimulated by our recognition that it is increasingly difficult to travel to China for research due to things like not only COVID, but also the recent executive order ending Fulbright grants to China and Hong Kong. And it's also out of the recognition that archival collections in China are becoming increasingly restricted. So in this webinar, our 4 panelists will be discussing how they have pursued research on different topics and different time periods in Chinese history without necessarily having to rely so heavily on Chinese archives. So we're very lucky to be joined by an esteemed panel of participants, each of whom will speak for approximately 10 to 12 minutes. At the end of the session, we'll open up for a Q&A. And again, if you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any point during the webinar. We will collect those questions and ask them at the end. So let's get right to it. Speaking first is Tobie Meyer-Fong, who is a professor of history at Johns Hopkins University, and she recently finished a stint as director of the East Asian Studies program there. She is the author of 2 books, Building Culture in Early Qing Yangzhou, and more recently, What Remains? Coming to Terms with Civil War in 19th Century China. So I will turn it over to you, Tobie.
Great, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. So thank you so much, Emily and Denise, for including me in this conversation. It's really a pleasure to do a little bit of propaganda work for an institution that's been extremely good to me over the past two and a half decades. I started using the Chinese collection at the Library of Congress when I returned from doing my dissertation research in China in 1996. My then boyfriend, now husband, was living in Washington, D.C. I was working on my PhD at Stanford. The Bay Area was insanely expensive. I had good reason to be living in D.C. And so when he said to me, well, where do you want to live in D.C.? I said, well, that's obvious. I want to be near the Library of Congress. And so in 1996, we rented an apartment 5 blocks south of the Library of Congress and subsequently bought a house across the street from the apartment 5 blocks south of the Library of Congress. So I've been actually lurking in the vicinity of the Library of Congress Asia Division for 25 years and finished writing my dissertation in the reading room in the library and did significant research on the Yangzhou book, particularly the gazetteer work in the Library of Congress, did a very sizable chunk of the research for What Remains in the Library of Congress with 2 shorter research trips to libraries in China when my son was quite young. And it was easier to be using the neighborhood library rather than traveling to China for extended periods of time. And I also did all of the research for the article, The Printed World, which was an overview of recent publications in English about Chinese print culture, but which, as background for which I read several works in Japanese and Chinese as well. So suffice it to say, I think the Asia Division at the Library of Congress, especially the Chinese collection, is a great place for scholars at all stages of their career. It also happens to be a great place to meet other scholars. I, in fact, met Denise Ho when she was a graduate student using the Library of Congress. You see other people working, you get nosy and sociable, and you end up making friends. So thinking outside the archive, think of the Library of Congress as an option for research. First of all, it's an absolutely spectacular setting in which to do your research. It also is the largest collection of Chinese material housed in a single institution in the United States, and it's open as a matter of policy to all researchers above high school age. So it's extremely easy to get permission to use the collection as you basically, well, I'll explain the process momentarily. Before you visit though, it's always a really good idea to investigate what they have. And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. And it's actually easier to do this now than it was 5 years ago, because they've put the entire collection now into the electronic catalog. 5 years ago, you had to actually use the card catalog to find the pre-1958 Chinese books, but they're now all available if you use the catalog. You can also get information about the collection using these two links, which Emily and Denise will send out to you as a handout. So use the electronic catalog to identify the books that you might want to see before you come. You go to the electronic catalog. Please don't try to use Pinyin to find the books. Use Chinese to achieve greater accuracy. I've tried using Pinyin. I never find anything. If I use Chinese, I always find it. If you try the title and nothing pops up, try the author. If you try the author and nothing comes up, try the title. For pre-58 books, use traditional characters to search. If you don't find what you're looking for with simplified, try traditional. It's really quirky. I don't fully understand the catalog, but usually if I try multiple ways of looking, they have it, which is strange, but it works. So just keep trying, and hopefully the books that you are looking for will show up. I had the experience of being in Beijing a long time ago, found a list of books that I thought were only available in Beijing. I thought, I should check before I spend a lot of time taking notes by hand. I don't have a lot of time. I emailed one of the librarians at the Library of Congress with the list, and probably 2/3 of the books that I thought were only available in Beijing turned out also to have duplicate copies in the Library of Congress, which saved me an incredible amount of time and effort. And also it's much easier to reproduce photographically or using a scanner the books in the Library of Congress than it would be in China. The collection is huge. The collection of Chinese materials originated with a gift from the Qing government to the United States in 1869. It was further augmented with strategic purchases, and in the earlier years, these were facilitated by a botanist in the Department of Agriculture named Walter Swingle, who was interested in finding out more information about growing Chinese citrus in the United States, apparently. So they have great material, for example, on Fujian. And Walter Swingle realized that local gazetteers would have information about local products. So he started the collection of local gazetteers, which is among the finest in the world. Leftovers were given from the Qing government to, leftovers from the St. Louis Exposition were donated to the Library of Congress. And after 1928, the Department of Chinese Literature, which later became the Asian Division, was founded and led by Arthur Hummel. The early years were all about making the American National Library as great as the British Library and other great institutions in Europe. This meant that they emphasized humanistic collecting rare books, gazetteers, and it was founded in a competitive spirit. Therefore, they acquired all kinds of stuff, especially illustrated books, Ming Dynasty books, dictionaries, local gazetteers, things dealing with plants, animals, technology, pharmacopoeia, geography, and works associated with Zhuxi. It's a strange list, but they acquired anything they could get their hands on, and it was affordable at that time, and their goal was to be a great national library. And the records of reports from Arthur Hummel to the Librarian of Congress are full of celebratory language. This is actually predates Hummel, but by 1917, the report to the Librarian of Congress said that it was already the largest, most readily accessible, best cataloged, and most used of any in America. In many lines, it is already the equal, if not superior, of any in Western countries. So in this context, humanistic collecting was a major objective. After Pearl Harbor, and especially after World War II, they took a pragmatic turn and began emphasizing things of a more utilitarian and contemporary nature. But as a result of this early impetus, they have one of the best and most extensive collections of rare books, including 30 works from the Song and Yuan, many from the Ming, and lots of great stuff from the Qing. If you're interested in learning more, there's a published catalog which contains an annotated description of works in the collection by Wang Zhongmin, published in 1957. A continuation of that, published subsequently, contains another nearly 1,000 works. The definition of rare books has become larger, so anything pre-Jiaqing, so before 1796, is considered rare. There's some special rules for reading rare books. Pencil only, sit at a particular table. But in theory, you should be able to access rare books and read them if you are a serious scholar or graduate student and apply for permission to read rare books in the Library of Congress. Local gazetteers, for example, for my first book on Yangzhou in the Library of Congress, I was able to see all of the Qing editions of the Yangzhou Gazetteer in paper form. They have the actual string-bound originals of the complete run of Qing gazetteers from Jiangsu. They also have very strong holdings from Hebei, Shandong, Sichuan, and Shanxi. It is the largest collection of gazetteers outside of China. It's underutilized. You can find all of this information on their website. Just one important point, the Asian division is not the only unit in the library that has Chinese materials. I've also used the law library within the Library of Congress, which has the Qing Huidian and other surprises that have been categorized as law. The Prints and Photographs division has excellent old photos of China. The Geography and Maps division is incompletely cataloged, but has a substantial, it's incompletely and sometimes inaccurately cataloged, but for example, the painting of a battle scene in Nanjing in map form during the Taiping War is in the Geography and Maps division and ended up digitized in part, I think, because I requested it for my book, and then it ended up on their website. Before World War II, again, humanistic. Now the collecting is more narrow. The pre-58 collection materials are now accessible using the online catalog, which is a huge breakthrough. They're currently cataloging their previously uncatalogued, unidentified Manchu language materials, which is a not insignificant collection of several hundred items, and they're preparing it for scholarly use now. The Geography and Maps division has online digitized almost 400 of its items, and plans are afoot to digitize more of the rare materials in the Chinese collection, a significant number of which can already be accessed from home online. The library also has a significant number of databases. Subscription databases can be accessed only from IP addresses within the library, but if you bring your laptop, you can use the library Wi-Fi to get an IP address on your computer. If you log in through their Wi-Fi, you have their IP address. And so you can then use a library terminal in the reading room to save articles and items from the databases to your laptop, or to a flash drive. There may be some restrictions on this, but in theory, you could go into the Library of Congress and download all of the articles you need from China academic journals, for example. And you can learn which databases they have from their reading room's website. They're very proud of the databases. If you ask the librarians, they'll really emphasize access to databases as one of the strengths of the collection. I would argue that the pre-58 collection is maybe the main attraction for me, but the databases should be very attractive because they are available to everyone, even if your home library doesn't have them. You can start using things in the Library of Congress collection from the comfort of your own home. Any of their digital collections produced by the Library of Congress itself are accessible from your house. This includes the new Chinese Rare Book Digital Collection, which is beautiful digital copies of page by page of entire books. The Nashi manuscript collection is available online, and material related to Hokkaido also available online. So these digital collections from within the library can be accessed from your house. If you are in Washington, D.C. and you want to come to the library, your first stop is this more modern building, the Madison building. Bring your passport, US or foreign, or your US driver's license, and you can get a reader's ID card. You fill out a simple questionnaire describing your research interests, and within 10 minutes, you will be the proud owner of a Library of Congress ID. You then walk back across the street to the Jefferson building, and you enter the ground floor. You check your coat, your computer bag, and your other belongings on the ground floor. You take a moment, or if you're me anyway, you take a moment, you appreciate the grandeur, celebrate the opportunity to read in such a magnificent building, and marvel at the grand intellectual and cultural aspirations of the United States as inscribed in architecture in 1897. You take your computer without its case, a small purse, pens, pencils, flash drive, camera, smartphone on silent, into the reading room. You want the flash drive to download your articles from the databases, but also they have the best scanner that I have ever seen in my life. It's a fantastic museum quality book scanner that you can use to copy non-rare library materials. You can also save from the databases, and the scanner is free if you scan to your flash drive. Photocopies are 25 cents a page, and you can't photocopy old string-bound books. So bring your flash drive, bring your computer, use their scanner. It's a very hospitable reading room. It's beautiful, it's usually empty. I'm often the only one lurking in this gorgeous reading room. They would love to have more people reading in the reading room. They have great reference books. If you're pleco addicted, you can use your phone, but if you want to use the Hanyu Datsurian or the Morohashi or Matthews, they're all there. They have specialists in Chinese materials. The chief of the Asia division is a historian of early China and the former librarian at Stanford, Xiao Dongfang. Jeffrey Wang has a PhD in history from Georgetown and specializes in the pre-modern collection, and he's the one who upgraded the cataloging of the pre-58 collection and is currently supervising the Manchu collection. Song Yu is in charge of the modern collection. He's shown here giving a fantastic presentation to the senior thesis research seminar of the East Asian Studies program at Johns Hopkins. They're very happy to arrange conversations about the collection. There even is a fellowship to bring graduate students to do research in the library, up to $3,000 to travel to and from Washington and pay for overnight accommodations. It's called the Florence Tan Mosen Fellowship, and there's information about that on the website. The library is completely closed due to the pandemic. I wrote to the librarian and they said that the main reading room will open before the Asia division does. When the main reading room opens, you can access the Asia-related subscription databases from your laptop in the main reading room. You can access Asian division books by requesting them in the main reading room, including items from the pre-58 collection. but you won't have access to the reference books shelved in the Asia division until the reading room reopens. So that's the Library of Congress in a nutshell. I hope that I will someday meet many of you in the reading room. It's a great place to do research and a good alternative, more local than traveling to China, and you'll be surprised by what they have. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much, Tobie. Could you end your screen sharing?
Oh, absolutely.
Tobie, along with all of the other panelists, have graciously offered to share their PowerPoints with all of the registered attendees after this. And Tobie has also made a kind of cheat sheet for people who are hoping to use the Library of Congress, which we will share with you in an email tomorrow. So for now, we will go to Peter Zarrow, who is professor of history at University of Connecticut, and he previously served as a research fellow and deputy director in the Institute of Modern History at Academia Sinica in Taiwan. He is the author of numerous books and articles. I'll just name two: Educating China, Knowledge, Society, and Textbooks in a Modernizing World, and he has a forthcoming book called Abolishing Boundaries: Global Utopias in the Formation of Modern Chinese Political Thought. So we'll turn it over to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Emily. I'm not sure who I'm talking to exactly, but I'll assume you're mostly interested in China and not Taiwan. But under the circumstances, you might find it useful to visit Taiwan as opposed to a trip to China at this point. So I'll just kind of introduce resources that I found useful in Taiwan or know something about. If now I don't have a PowerPoint or anything, I'm sorry about that, but I can type out anything you might need later. Generally speaking, everything I'm going to talk about, pretty much everything, is accessible to visitors in Taiwan. Archivists, librarians might want to see your passport or at most some kind of letter from a home institution. Just say a word about getting to Taiwan, if it would be useful. For postdocs, there are competitive scholarships at the universities and at Academia Sinica, Joan, which I will talk about. For people who haven't gotten their doctorates yet, there are scholarships available from two sources: the Ministry of Education and the Center for China Studies, which is located in the National Library. So with that, let me say a word about some of the resources available there, some of which you have to be there for, some of which you actually don't. The Academia Sinica Library is pretty fantastic. As an intellectual historian, I haven't used archives very extensively, though I've used some for little bits. So mostly I use libraries to just look up people's published collected works, journals, newspapers, political pamphlets from back in the day, late Qing, Republican period, and so forth. That's all available, along with a great deal of scholarship, almost everything you can think of in Chinese, or for that matter, Japanese, English, a fair amount of Korean, and some European languages as well. And of course, through the libraries is access to a great number of mainland databases, as some of the ones I'll talk about more particularly. Particularly then, at Academia Sinica are no less than 3 history institutes: Modern History of China, a kind of general history, Institute of History and Philology, which I think has particular strengths in the ancient period, in medical history, and in Ming-Qing social history, in terms of their resources and research. And of course, the Institute of Taiwan History, as you might expect, several other institutes in the humanities and social sciences, literature and philosophy, and ethnography or anthropology, really, which this last one focuses mostly on Taiwan kind of minorities and tribal peoples. Not entirely. Okay, so let me talk about a couple of specific databases and or archives. The Institute of History and Philology, the 历史与研究所, has what they call the Academia Sinica Scripta Sinica. There's a certain fondness for Latinate titles at Academia Sinica. This is the Hanji Chuan and Ziliao Ku, which is a database then of classics and commentaries on the classics. I've personally found it quite useful for Qing period information. It's not directly open to the public. There is an online application system where they'll just give you access, I think for a year, without much question about it. The Institute of History and Philology also has its own Mingqing archives with memorials and other documents from the Grand Secretariat. This is something that's not comparable to the first historical archives in Beijing, obviously, but if you can't get to Beijing, it's not at all a bad start. Along with the National Palace, the Gugong Dangangguan, there's a great number of resources, not just formal memorials, but kind of hand-scrawled within the bureaucracy memos that go back and forth in both of these archives, the Mingqing archives at Academia Sinica and the National Palace Museum archives nearby enough. Okay, at the Institute of Modern History at Academia Sinica are a number of databases. Most of these are also closed but open either to online application, or you can write the director and ask for permission to use them for a certain period of time. One that I've used fairly extensively is a database of dictionaries, English, Chinese, English dictionaries that appeared from about, I think, 1815 or 1820 into the 1920s. And if you want to sort of trace particular terms and how they're actually being talked about in the translingual dictionaries, that's very convenient to use. The Institute of Modern History also has a collection of memorials from the Qing Dynasty. This is another online database, so it's really quick to use. Maybe for the more modern period, late Qing and Republican, there's a fairly large database of xiaobao, of these sort of tabloid papers that came out of Shanghai and a few other cities starting in the late Qing. That's called the Modern Urban Tabloid database. There's databases that focus on guidebooks to Chinese cities in Chinese, none in English that I can think of offhand. Again, starting from the late Qing through the Republican period. There's also the Hushi archive. So if anybody happens to be studying Hushi, of course, there's important archives in Beijing, but might be easier to start with the friendly archivists at Academia Sinica for Hushi as well. The diary is now completely online, I think. So you don't even have to be in Taipei for that. What am I forgetting? The Institute of Modern History has some databases that are slightly weird, for lack of a better word. One is what they're called the Modern Annals database. You type in a date, and what will pop out, depending on the date, are Zhengfu Gongbao entries, the government proclamations for that date. If it's a date covered in Chiang Kai-shek's diaries, his diary entry will pop out, and that's been digitalized, so you can actually read it as opposed to handwriting. And there's several other diaries in that database as well. There's also databases of who's who type materials, so it's useful as a start for looking up quick biographical entries, and some other kind of specialized databases. So if you're interested in Qing Dynasty grain prices, for example, a researcher and their assistants at Academia Sinica have actually spelled those all out. There's a couple of physical archives which are partially digitalized, but still mostly not, at the Institute of Modern History at Academia Sinica. One is archives of the Foreign Ministry with documents starting from the late Qing through the Republican period, which is especially thorough there, and into the Republic of China post-1949. In other words, Taiwan's Foreign Ministry documents as well. Just glancing through those, this is when I came across internal bureaucratic letters back and forth when people in the Foreign Ministry under Yuan Shikai were all very concerned about Americans desecrating the altar of heaven by playing football there. So you can come across some odd things. Second major archives at the Institute of Modern History are the economic archives from, again, the economic ministries, the Ministry of Agriculture, from the late Qing, better documented for the ROC period, particularly after 1928, and into the 1970s on Taiwan as well. Aside from Academia Sinica, Taipei features the Kuomintang archives. I have not used these myself, but I've talked to people who have used them. And they are now more accessible than they used to be. In fact, the Kuomintang claims that they're completely open to the public, although it also appears that some documents were removed by someone or another before this official opening came. But be that as it may, again, it is pretty accessible and pretty useful for any kind of political questions from really 1925, going back to the Guangzhou government onward. Where else was I going with that? Okay, aside from the Kuomintang archives, related to that is the archives of the Bureau of Investigation, the sort of MI6, FBI, CIA, Diaotaju of the Kuomintang period, which scholars from America in the 1960s and even 1970s used fairly extensively before they could get to China. And I honestly don't know whether there's anything there still worth looking at, but it wouldn't at all surprise me. Okay, the third kind of institutional organization I'll talk about is Academia Sinica, Academia Historica, the Guoshiguan, which has a number of documents. I sometimes have the impression most of what's not in Academia Sinica and some of what's not in the Nanjing Second Historical Archives, you're going to find in the Guoshiguan for the ROC Republic of China period again. It's very strong then on government documents, but I also use it a little bit. It has sort of odd things you can find by putting in the names of people you're interested in, for example. It might have police reports on them. It might have letters to them from government officials, things like that. It also has the Yanshishan archives from Shanxi, going back to the 1920s and 1930s as well. So this is, most of the catalogs of all of these places are online, so you can see ahead of time if there might be stuff that you're interested in. Okay, I'll just mention a couple of other things quickly. For anybody interested in conceptual history or intellectual history, the database for the study of modern Chinese thought, running from the dates of materials they've collected from 1830 into 1930, is located at 政治大学 in Taipei. This is the 中国近现代思想及文学史专业数据库. I've used that in the past. I've lost touch a bit. It was originally put together by Jin Guantao and Liu Qing. They've been trying to use sort of high-tech textual analysis or computational techniques to look at how the grammatical placing of certain key words has changed over time, and what that might tell us about how concepts have evolved or maybe devolved, again, over this 100 years of the late Qing and early Republican, mid-Republican period. They've put a lot of text in there and the tools you can use to play around with them. And you can see, if you're interested in the concept of liberty, 自由, you can put 自由 in and see what terms have come nearby, say within 10 characters or within 20 characters in writings over the course of that century. And then I've already mentioned the National Palace Museum archives, Qing documents. Again, if these are mostly available in databases or in fact physically published that you can get hold of without going to Taipei. But there are some materials in there that have not yet been published, sort of scraps again of these inter-bureaucratic memorials or memos rather. And as well, the archives of the museum itself, which I've been using for a new project. I was using them last winter. Everything, by the way, in Taipei is now open. Libraries and archives were closed briefly back in, I guess, March and April. But given Taiwan's success in combating the spread of the coronavirus infection, everything is now pretty much as open as it used to be, although people are encouraged to wash their hands with alcohol and still wear masks while you're working inside the library. So, okay, if you just go online and Google around, I think you can find access to most of this stuff. But again, if you type me a chat, I can respond with the actual names of anything you want to look into more thoroughly. Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Peter. If anyone has any questions about any of the institutions that Peter mentioned, maybe you could ask it in the Q&A and Peter can respond directly using the Q&A function, just so we have it in textual form. Okay, so speaking next is Joan Judge, who is a professor of history at York University. Professor Judge has published widely on print culture, publishing, and gender in modern China, and she is the author of, among other books, The Precious Raft of History, The Past, the West, and the Woman Question in China, and Republican Lens, Gender, Visuality, and Experience in the Early Chinese Periodical Press. So over to you, Joan.
All right, so I first want to really commend Emily and Denise for putting this series together, and it's wonderful. They plan to pick it up again next summer, but I'd love to encourage many of you in the audience, if you have ideas for a similar series and resources, to think about possibly creating other webinars like this, because there's clearly a need. So my brief today is to talk about Japan. And Japan was, in the context of Cold War 1.0, sort of a workaround for Chinese scholars who couldn't go to China. And many of the scholars who have trained us, whose works that we depend on, worked in Japan and used Japanese collections. In our current, what we could think of as Cold War 2.0, we can also think of Japan as a workaround for those of us who can't get to China. But I really would like to emphasize that it's much more than a workaround, and that for any of us who work on China, we should really have some degree of familiarity with what Japan has to offer us. And it has to offer us things. I'm going to talk about 3 particular areas: sources, scholars, students, and I'll say a little bit about grants and a little bit about language. So sources, first of all, and to sort of situate myself, I am an historian of Lake Qing and the Republic. As Emily has said, I've recently been working on vernacular knowledge and looking for sort of low-level texts, book catalogs from, very second-tier publishers, etc. And I found absolutely tremendous riches in Japan. I've been going to Japan for over 20 years. I've done a couple of long stints, and actually just came back in March from being a visiting scholar at Kyoto University. So most useful sources in Japan are for the late imperial period and the modern. There are some sources for the PRC period, but that is not the greatest richness that you will find there. There are a number of excellent libraries. The Toyo Bunko, a place where I found, I've been scouring libraries in East Asia and the West for the last 5 years on this project. And the Toyo Bunko, I didn't just find things I couldn't find elsewhere, but I found things that I didn't know existed anywhere else. Really, really a unique, it's an idiosyncratic collection, but some really excellent material in it. The National Diet Library is really the corollary of what Tobie just introduced as the Library of Congress in Washington. This is the depository library in Japan. Again, tremendous riches, some idiosyncrasy, but more systematic than the Toyo Bunko. They also have excellent online sources, digital sources, many texts that you can actually download without even having to go to Japan. And I've got all of the links here. And the third link is particularly valuable in giving you a sense of what is available all over Japan. So sitting at the National Diet Library in Tokyo, you can search bibliographic data for the most obscure regional libraries, museum libraries, archives, etc. My greatest find on this last trip to Japan, when I was there from September to March, recently was the Kansai-kan, which is actually an arm of the Diet Library. And it's situated about 2 hours outside of Kyoto. It's a little hard to get to, but this is the library that now houses most of the rare Chinese materials. It's infinitely easier to use than the Diet Library in Tokyo. It's much less bureaucratized. And again, the collection is, has some startling finds in it. Okay, so should I go back to those other slides? That's the Kansai-kan. These are libraries and collections, but I will share the PowerPoint, so you will all be able to have access to this information. There are also excellent university libraries. The best are probably at Tokyo University and Kyoto University. These are the major public universities and have very rich and deep collections of materials for, again, late imperial and Republican China mostly. Private universities also, Kansai University is on the screen, and Keio, which is, Kansai is near Osaka, Keio in Tokyo. One of the really interesting phenomena in Japanese libraries is they often have the collections of a particular scholar. So under Kansai University, the Masuda Bunko, this is the archival collection of a scholar named Masuda. And that was an example of a place where, again, I found tremendous riches. It's his idiosyncratic collection. He was more interested in literature, but he had some, a fine collection of daily use encyclopedias, which I've been searching for on this current project. So all of these libraries have, these particular collections within them. There are other sort of what would be considered minor libraries, such as the Tokyo Metropolitan Library. But again, this one has a bunko, and it's Sanato Keishu's. And he, as probably many of you know, was the scholar of the overseas students in Japan, the Chinese overseas students in Japan. So his archive, which he contributed to this library, also has tremendous riches for people working on the late Qing period and also the Republic. Archives are probably not as useful in Japan for those of us working on China, but again, it depends on the topic. The most useful might be the diplomatic archives. I use those, for example, when I was working on the press, and I wanted to get a sense of how the Japanese who were in China were viewing the press. I was able to get better circulation numbers for newspapers in these archives than I was probably anywhere else. So if you're working on a topic that has, a close connection, even something like the 1911 revolution, clearly something like the anti-Japanese boycotts, these archives could be very useful. And one thing to bear in mind, as sort of tortured as the history of Sino-Japanese relations has been, the Japanese were incredibly informed and close observers of what went on in China. And we can, glean a tremendous amount from the documents that they have left. So in terms of practical access to use these different libraries and archives, the National Diet Library is unique. Again, it sounds a bit like what Tobie was saying about the Library of Congress. You can register and get a user's card, and it's very convenient. You can renew it online and for 3 years at a time. Other libraries, in theory, you can get in by just using your passport, some form of ID. It's always good to travel with name cards. They're still a really important currency in Japan. But I often in the past, particularly if it's a short visit, will write to a library in advance. So if you want to use the East Asian Institute at Tokyo University, for example, I would encourage you to get a sense of the sources you'd like to use online, write to the librarians, and they can even have the materials ready for you when you arrive. And it is possible, I think, to write in English, but much better perhaps to try to craft a letter in Japanese or get someone to help you. And it's always good to travel with a letter. If you're a graduate student, perhaps a letter from your supervisor or a letter from your home librarian, just something that sort of says you're legitimate in doing legitimate research. So the second real strength of spending time in Japan as a scholar of China are the scholars in Japan. And these include a tremendous number of Chinese scholars. So the seminars that I went to this last time when I was in Kyoto for 6 months, about half of the scholars in the seminars were from China. They were either junior faculty who had jobs in Japan, or they were graduate students. There are also a tremendous number of visiting scholars from China in Japan, and they can be tremendous resources. I met somebody who teaches at Xiamen University, where I've had no contacts, and she introduced me to a couple of recent PhD students who are doing work very similar to what I'm working on, and whose work I wouldn't have been aware of. It won't see print probably for a couple of years. And this has been an incredibly productive exchange. And I'm actually trying to get one of those young scholars onto an AES panel. So these are the kinds of connections that you can make in Japan. Japanese scholars have sort of an academic culture of kenkyukai, or research groups. And if there happens to be one on a topic close to what you're working on, these can be tremendous riches in terms of getting a sense of sources, scholars, and different levels of scholarship on a particular topic. Some of these are, you know, they change every couple of years. Some are on a particular topic. One of them did, for example, a translation of Liang Qichao's Nianpu, the chronological biography. They spent, I think, close to a decade translating that. There's a very active group for those of you interested in women's history. That is a long-standing research group in Tokyo. And I've got the name and an image of their journal on the screen. This group was founded in 1977. And there's now sort of a maverick offshoot that is situated in the Kansai area near Kyoto. And I actually addressed that group last February. And again, a dynamic, wonderful set of scholars, and at least 2 in the group are actually, you know, Chinese nationals who are now teaching in Japan. Another real strength for going, another great reason for going to Japan are the students, graduate students, tremendous numbers who have come from China. Kyoto University, I was told that in the East Asian Studies, the Toyoshi, close to 99% of the students are Chinese. The Japanese students just aren't as interested in East Asian history now. So if you were to go there as a graduate student, this would be your cohort. So again, these people would be able to give you tremendous insights into access to Chinese sources, and they would just be, you know, a wonderful cohort to study with. In terms of grants, you are probably best off as a China scholar going to Japan with a China grant, but there are a number of Japanese grants, and depending on your topic, you may be able to land one of them. I did have a Japan Foundation grant over 20 years ago, the first time I stayed in Japan for a long period of time. I was working on the late Qing. I wrote the project up, you know, as really comparing, I think it was like views of the people in Minchuan between China and Japan, and it was a fabulous grant to get. The second group, Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, I've heard has mostly been giving grants to Asianists and Southeast Asianists, but they want to redress that balance now. So there might be opportunities there in the future. For many of these grants, it really helps to have some kind of a contact in Japan, somebody who can write for you. For the Japan Society for the Promotion of Sciences grant, quite often these are collaborative, but these are all things to keep in mind if you become serious about wanting to do research in Japan. So the elephant in the room is probably the Japanese language, which, as we all know, is not easy and is often the stumbling block that deters people from going to Japan and investing in, you know, what it takes to go and effectively do research there. If you're early in your graduate career, or even if you're not, I would highly recommend the Inter-University Center for Japanese Language Studies in Yokohama. This is probably the best program offered in Japan, but there are many, many others. So I don't want to say this is the only one, but it is really high quality. I worked a bit with a student, a graduate student from Heidelberg who was in Kyoto, who had just come out of the program, and her Japanese was fabulous. So they do an intensive 10-month training program in advanced Japanese. So advanced Japanese means you have to have 2 years under your belt before you go. They also do summer programs, which might be worth thinking about. And they do professional tutorials for people who have a certain knowledge of Japanese and want to work on, you know, reading a particular kind of text, for example. In terms of improving your Japanese reading ability, which is something, again, that I highly recommend because there is so much secondary literature on China written in Japanese. Really any topic that we delve into, some aspect of it has probably been covered by a Japanese scholar. There's a recent textbook that is co-edited by Fumiko Jo and someone else, and this is an excellent place to start if you want to improve your ability to read Japanese sources as a scholar of China. And one final point about language is that Japan is now very committed to globalization. So even though you won't find many librarians or archivists with extremely good English, they do know some, and many of the Japanese scholars are quite proficient in English at this point. If you have any specific questions, you know, as Denise and Emily said, we will be sharing our PowerPoints. All of these URLs will be shared with you. But if you have any specific questions, please don't hesitate to email me and I will answer your questions if I can. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan. And if you could also stop sharing your screen, great. So last but not least, we will go to Jeremy Brown, who is an associate professor of history at Simon Fraser University. Professor Brown is one of the foremost voices on PRC history today, and he is the author or editor of 3 books, including City versus Countryside in Mao's China and Maoism at the Grassroots, Everyday Life in China's Era of High Socialism. So over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Emily and to Denise for inviting me, and to all the other panelists for their really useful presentations. I have good news. Let me start with good news, and then I'll get to some bad news, and then I'll get to some practical ways for you to do some research on and find grassroots documents from the comfort of your own home without going to China. So the good news is that actually you can go to archives in China right now. If you are in China, you can go and go through the usual procedures and walk into a municipal archive. And I know of 2 students who are there right now who are actually going regularly to Chinese archives that have reopened because the pandemic is under control in many places, and are able to get and use and take notes on documents from the post-1949 period. So even though we're talking about going beyond the archive, don't forget the archive, don't give up. Just because you hear that archives are closed or restricted, don't quit. Obviously, your access to these archives are going to be dependent on your identity. What kind of passport do you have? Are you legally allowed to enter China? Do you have funding to do so? But don't give up on archives, is what I will say. So that's the good news. And if you're in China, you can also do the kind of grassroots document collecting that I still think is possible, that is best done if you are living in a Chinese place, in a city, and getting connected in a local way to professors at a university who can introduce you to where are the used book markets, who are the vendors. Once you get going and you go to the used book markets every week, you can buy documents and create your own collection. And that, if you're in China, is something that you're still going to be able to do. So that's the good news. And I guess the bad news is that it's risky to do this. So aside from some of the things that have been in the news recently, like the Japanese scholar who was detained for apparently just purchasing a book in a used bookstore, you've heard about that kind of thing. That seems strange. It seems irregular. It doesn't seem like the main, I don't know how to explain that, but there are other risks anecdotally that I've heard of that were not in the news. For example, one researcher was visited by the police who knew that the researcher had bought items on Kongfuzi Jiushu Wang, and those books were confiscated because he was told by the police that he wasn't allowed to have those, and was also told that the vendor had been arrested for selling unauthorized things on Kongfuzi. That's one story. There's another story of a vendor who was told that he would be arrested unless he could recover all of the things that he had sold illicitly to a certain person or institution. So it's possible to do it. There are risks. There always have been. The risks seem to be getting worse and worse, and everybody needs to make their own personal risk assessment. And again, that's going to be based on your identity and your status and your passport and your career stage. The risks are high. For me, I think that means that the value of doing the work is important and as important as ever, but it's too bad, right? It's too bad that these risk levels are actually suppressing and they're presenting a disincentive to do research, but it's still possible. Let me tell you how I would recommend going about it. Let me start by defining what I mean by grassroots documents and things that you can buy or find online or in used book markets. By grassroots, I mean documents that talk about or originate from the lowest levels of Chinese society, meaning village or a neighborhood or a local danwei. And I like to divide them into non-archival and formerly archival. So non-archival grassroots documents are things like diaries. So these diaries I bought in Tianjin, and they're not archival, right? An individual young person in Tianjin during the 1960s and 70s wrote them. You can buy them, you can read them if your eyes are good. It's not that easy to read, but this is a non-archival document, right? It doesn't, the state did not create this. The state has no claim to it, and it's been relinquished for sale on the open market. Another category of non-archival would be letters between family members or acquaintances where the state is not involved. I don't have any of those in my collection, but Zhang Letian in Shanghai, professor at Fudan, is starting to publish these, and university libraries are publishing excerpts of letters, family letters. So that's another non-archival category. Another non-archival type of document that you can buy at the grassroots would be, I'm getting this pile of like Red Guard newsletters here. You can buy lots of Red Guard newsletters. This is from China's flourishing of freedom of speech in 1966 and 1967, when individual people or autonomous organizations set up their printing press and publish these newsletters. And again, the state's not involved, right? The state has no claim over these things, or if they do, I'm not convinced by that claim. And so this is another thing that's really common to find in markets and on Kongfuzi. It's extremely difficult to use because you need to understand the whole context of rebel organizations and other organizations during the Cultural Revolution. It's quite complicated, but I have a bunch of those. So those are non-archival. Then you have formerly archival, meaning documents that look the same as what is held in a district archive in a city or a county archive in the countryside or a danwei reading room. It's just happened that these former archival documents have been determined to be no longer useful or interesting or worth holding, and they become garbage. They're discarded and they become available on the open market. So if you look at this collection of formerly archival documents that I purchased in Tianjin, if you've ever been to a Chinese archive and look at PRC documents and you diaojuan, this will be the kind of thing, will be the kind of juan that you get. This came from a danwei, and it looks like an archival, the kind of archive. So I want to be clear that when you're doing garbology, this is now garbage, right? It's no longer an archive because the danwei or the archive has determined that it's not worth keeping. It is garbage, but it is a former archive, and it is created by the state, and we can use it to answer all kinds of interesting historical questions. But the problem with that is when you cite this source, for example, so what I just showed you there are accident reports, traffic crash reports from the mid-1980s in the suburbs of Tianjin. Say I want to cite this. I'm the only one in the world that possesses this document. How are you going to trust the authenticity of this document? How are you going to really know where it came from? And how are you going to assess whether you think my use of it is convincing? And my solution to this, and now I will share my screen, is to make all of the documents that I have cited in my published work publicly available on the internet at this site right here, which is PRC History Source Transparency. So for example, if you want to see anything that I've cited from my personal collection from City versus Countryside, or chapters in books, or the more recent thing that I'm starting to post here is from this co-authored piece by Xia Qingqing. And here's a diary, and you can go and actually just read the diary. And if you have any questions about our argument or any questions about the authenticity, you can actually just go and read this source. So that's one solution, but the issue is it's too limited for me, because I'm only sharing with you things that I've cited in my published work. When I work on a project, I'm only going to cite between 1% and 5% of the massive pile of sources that I've collected about that topic. I have to read it all, I have to look at it all, I have to see patterns, and I'm only going to pick certain things that I'm actually going to cite. So I have a lot more in my collection than what shows up in my footnotes. And my solution to that is to create a database that's modeled on the Maoist legacy database that Amanda Schumann talked about 2 webinars ago and gave her own presentation about. So that's a model of transparency and sharing broadly. And so here at Simon Fraser University, we are currently building a database that will be open to all researchers, that it will be full text searchable. Here's what it looks like. It's very crude right now. We started uploading documents related to Criticize Lin, Criticize Confucius. So once this is live, I will announce it on HPRC, and you will be able to read all of the sources in my grassroots collection like this online. You can read the source and you can look at the information that we've tagged it with, subjects, description, creator, and so on. And I have an announcement as well. An acquaintance of mine named Sha Shangzhi, who happens to live in Burnaby, has agreed to donate a copy of her family's digital collection to this database. Her parents were high officials in Zhejiang province. She has a massive family archive that will also eventually be available to all researchers, digitized here through the SFU library. So I see I'm trying to share as much as possible, but since this isn't up yet, let me show you, let me finish by showing you a way that you can do garbological research with non-archival and formerly archival sources from the comfort of your own home. And that, of course, is through Kongfuzi Jiushu Wang. And so you can go to Kongfuzi Jiushu Wang from anywhere in the world, and you can use a keyword. I've used a keyword that Carl Gerth would be happy to see, which is chaojia. Chaojia means home searches or home ransackings. This is when Red Guards went into the houses of capitalists or other suspect individuals in 1966 and 67. You can pick your own keywords, but usually Cultural Revolution related words are going to be the ones that come up. And what I would urge you to do if you're going to search on Kongfuzi Jiushu Wang is to look for items that are currently for sale and look for items that have already been sold, because you can actually find images of items that have already been sold. And this is and you can mine that data for yourself, and you can actually use those images. So here are some documents that come up when I search for chaojia, and I limit the search between 1966 and 1980. Maybe that's too early to stop because they're still processing problem cases related to this into the early 1980s. There's 183 items for sale right now. And when you click on something that's interesting to you, you can actually see the images here. This one, you don't have to buy it. Ideally, you'd buy it if you think it's going to be useful and if you're inside China and can get it easily. But if you are outside of China, all you have to do is click on the photos here, and you can expand them, and you can save them to your hard drive, or use Zotero to take a snapshot of the page, or use the Wayback Machine, use an archival method to store these files for yourself. That is a primary source, a garbological source that now you can use for your research. And if you do a search for things that have already been sold, for example, these are items that have already been sold. There are 88 of them related to chaojia between 66 and 1980. And again, you can tell the ones that have images. If we search on this one that has images, the secret for the ones that have already been sold is it looks like there's nothing here, but then you click on this little thing called Zhangkai Xiangqing, and there you get the images. And again, you can do a right click, save image as, and this is now a primary source for you. Some of them are quite readable. Some of them are difficult to read. Guess what? That's what happens when you buy something in the flea market too. Some of them are difficult to read. So you have similar challenges, and you may not get every page of them, but if you spend a bit of time searching your keywords and mining things that have already been sold, things that are currently sold, you can actually find quite a bit, and I encourage you to do so. I also encourage you to check out the Maoist Legacy database, which is an even bigger, more extensive and thematically focused database in Freiburg. I encourage you to check out the Michael Schoenhall's collection in Lund, which is primarily the type of non-archival Red Guard newsletters and periodicals. But beyond that, there's actually a ton of collections inside of China where the Chinese university professors have been collecting this type of garbological material themselves, way more. They're putting money into it, they're putting resources into it, they're digitizing it. And I can think of at least 4 Chinese universities that have huge collections of either rural county archival material, formerly archival material, I would say, family letters, diaries, all kinds of amazingly useful things that exist in China. And what I would say about those is that don't push. to get access to those right now. If it turns out that access to these kind of collections inside China depends on your connections there, and it depends on the rules of the person who owns those materials, but it also depends on the political situation. And right now, the answer that you're going to get is this collection has been closed. And you might think that's bad news, but actually it's good news. It's a preservation method that these collections inside China need to lie low for the time being so that they are not actually seized or thrown away or destroyed. They're just laying low and don't push for now and wait for a better day so that all of this valuable material can once again become available to people doing research inside China, which is really the ideal scenario. So I will stop sharing my screen. I will leave it at that for my presentation and look forward to the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. Everything that you're doing with archiving your own materials is just super exciting. So I'd like to invite all of the panelists to turn on their videos again and unmute themselves. We've gotten a bunch of questions. We have a little under 20 minutes remaining. So I think what I'm gonna do is just start off by asking questions to individual panelists. And if you could keep your remarks to about 2 minutes or so, that would be great. And then if we have time at the end, I'll ask kind of more open-ended question to all of you. So maybe I'll start with Peter. You could turn your video on. There you are. Yeah. So you got a couple of questions about using archives and libraries in Taiwan. One of the questions was if you know of any citizenship restrictions to use these sorts of archival collections. Are they open to PRC citizens? And a kind of related question, do you need a Jie do you need a letter of introduction in order to use any of these collections?
Okay, it's nice to have Jie, but it's not really necessary. You should be able to walk into any of the libraries or archives I mentioned with your passport or some ID, and that should be fine. Citizenship, I'm very sorry to hear about your experience as a PRC citizen. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, that shouldn't happen if you were in Taipei, at least. I know many PRC scholars who've used the Guoshiguan as well as the Guomindang archives. So I don't know what's going on there.
And if I could ask one more follow-up question, you got a question about how to know the difference between the Academia Sinica, the Academia Historica, and the Guomindang archives. So could you just generally summarize what each of these collections hold so that researchers know where to maybe begin their search?
Okay, well, Guomindang archives focuses on the documents produced by the party and reports on China by party members from the 1920s onward, I mean, essentially till today. I'm not sure what the cutoff deadline is. That's the Guomindang archives. The Guoshiguan is mostly government documents, again, from 1925 onward, so from the mainland through 1948, and then Taiwan since 1949, various government bureaus. The Academia Sinica archives are much more sort of scattered. So there's Ming-Qing documents, well, mostly Qing memorials, then especially the Ministry of Economics from the Republican period and the Foreign Ministry from the late Qing. That's a quick answer, I guess.
Great, thank you. So Joan, you got a couple questions. One had to do with how important it is to have a working knowledge of Japanese in order to use collections in Japan. I mean, say you go to a public university, you have 5 years of funding, and you don't necessarily have the time or the resources to spend an entire year learning Japanese in Japan. Is it still possible to make use of these collections?
I think it would be, as long as you are competent in using the databases and ensuring that there are things that are going to be useful for you. And if you can make contact ideally with some scholar there who could maybe facilitate things for you. And again, people like myself who have spent time in Japan would be happy to mediate if there's a grad student we know who, you know, is looking for a particular kind of source that they could definitely find there. And I might know a scholar who could help with that. So I think it's possible. It's certainly not ideal, but you know, it's a character-based language, and that helps you with, you know, either, you know, communicating, just writing things down, or certainly with making your way through catalogs. So I would say possible, but not ideal.
Great. Tobie, so most of your research focuses on the Qing, or the late imperial period, but there were some people who are interested in 20th century materials at the Library of Congress, in particular, post-49 materials. Do you have any knowledge, or can you speak briefly about what sort of materials are held there?
So there have been several instances in the history of the collection where the institution has come under pressure to be focusing its acquisitions efforts on things that are more political or more immediate utilitarian value to Congress and to researchers on contemporary China. I haven't used those materials myself. I would say that the most marvelous things about the collection from where I sit are the older things. And I think that they were extremely successful in acquiring a wide-ranging collection of outstanding excellence, better than anywhere in the world for pre-58. I'm less confident saying that about the post-58 collection. They have been extremely proactive about acquiring the standard databases for research about contemporary China, and would certainly be helpful in pointing you in the direction of that kind of material. I know that there's some stuff there. I mean, I know that they have a post-58 collection. I know that it's cataloged, and again, best searched using characters, and try both simplified and traditional to see if you get your hits. But I don't have a strong sense of whether they have, what kinds of unique material they have. I know they have, I know that all of the Chinese language material held by the Southern Manchurian Railway Company in Japan ended up in the Library of Congress. And I know that a lot of material acquired by other US government agencies eventually got transferred to the Library of Congress. I haven't used it myself. I would say explore it and report back to me, because I'd love to know more about what they have. I think it's less famous as a venue for research on modern and contemporary history. That said, it's probably better than a lot of places, so worth a trip.
And a really quick follow-up question. If someone is interested in using really old, rare books and materials, how would they go about photographing them or reproducing them? Are you allowed to take individual photographs of these old materials?
It depends how old the material is and what kind of condition it is. And so the polite thing to do is to ask the librarian before you start shooting pictures. Or, you know, I mean, you could say, am I allowed to take pictures? They do have a scanner that is specifically designed to do effective scanning of string-bound books, this museum quality scanner, and you can scan right to your flash drive and do beautiful copies. That suggests to me that it is possible to safely scan, whereas it would not have been safe to use a photocopying machine. Ask the librarians. Probably not the extreme rare material, but 19th century stuff may be possible to shoot photos with your phone or use a scanner, but I haven't done that recently. And it's always best to ask permission.
So when in doubt, just ask the
librarian.
Common theme for this webinar. So Jeremy, I mean, the theme of this webinar is thinking outside the archive, but since you did mention archives, you got a question about how students and scholars are supposed to know how to navigate Chinese archives. How are they supposed to figure out what kinds of materials are held there, what kind of letter of introduction they need to gain access? Can you give us a kind of quick and dirty answer to that question?
Yeah, every archive is different. Every archive is different, and so the internet is going to be your friend just in terms of if the archive itself has an internet presence, it will have some official guidelines of how to gain access, and it may even be specific to, are you a Chinese citizen or are you a foreigner? And you can follow those guidelines, but the archive itself might not follow those guidelines. It's really a moving target, and so your best resource for these kind of questions, including where are the used book markets and how do you find garbological sources and how do you get into an archive, are going to be university professors and graduate students at the universities in the cities where you want to do work. And if you don't know anybody there, ask me. I might know, or ask your supervisor. First, ask your supervisor. And if your supervisor doesn't have contacts in that particular city, just use your networks and get an introduction to a professor and their grad students, because I'm really pleased at how helpful. I mean, basically, it's not just me, but probably the careers of almost everybody on this panel and all the professors who are in the audience are really dependent on the help that we've received from professors inside China and the graduate students and their willingness to see us all as engaged in the same project of trying to do and understand Chinese history. And so those are going to be your main resources, but some places you'll follow all the rules and they'll say no. Okay, go somewhere else. And then I just walked into this, the Hexi District Archive in Tianjin, and they said, sure, here's everything. And I was lucky at the time, and then they realized that they shouldn't have done it that way. So the next person who went was told no. But it really depends on your question. It depends on the place where you want to go. It depends at the level of the archive that you want to go to. But if you want to go to municipal or provincial, they're going to have a fairly standardized process that will require a letter of introduction from a local danwei, which is a university or a research institute. And then you just have to get approved. But yeah, it seems daunting, but the only way to know whether it's going to work is just to try. And yeah, Chinese citizens who are doing research right now this month are getting access. Non-Chinese citizens in the past couple of years have been able to go into Chinese archives pre-coronavirus. Post-coronavirus, it'll be interesting to see. But once you can get there, good luck, try it.
So I'm actually going to bring Denise into the Q&A, because there was a question about Hong Kong and how recent events in Hong Kong might affect our future access to sources and archives there. So Denise, what do you think about that question? What do you think are the future prospects for research on the PRC or research on China in Hong Kong?
Thanks for the question. I think I can't predict the future of Hong Kong. I think that things have happened a lot faster and have been much more severe than we thought they would be. I think that there's good news and bad news about the way Hong Kong libraries and archives work. The good news is that they are quite well organized and accessible. The Hong Kong Central Library has digitized newspapers. If you have access to a Hong Kong university as a visiting scholar, there is an inter-university library system. So if you want a pamphlet that's in another library, you can get it delivered. So it's very well organized that way. The Public Records Office is also very accessible. I think the bad news is that it can be very bureaucratic and sometimes opaque. So there is no archives law that governs the preservation of archival records in Hong Kong. And so the decision to preserve something or not is up to the individual archivist. And for more contemporary material, much of it is not open. So there are, I think, pre-existing opportunities and limitations on doing research in Hong Kong. Also, I think different collections tend to be very siloed. Like there'll be different pockets of oral history collections in different places, and they will have all used their own separate Cantonese vernacular transcription of this. So it's not quite so standardized. I think that as with any other source in China, use it while you can and download and access as much as you can for the moment. The University Services Center is still accessible. There are materials where you may not be able to look at catalogs until you actually, not the online catalog, but the actual materials until you were there on site. So that might require personal access. One thing that the current director pointed out is that maybe with more integration, it will be easier for them to actually purchase materials from China, because previously there had been customs regulations and so on. So I think I would be kind of cautious and use what you can while you can.
Great, thank you, Denise. So we have about 4 minutes left, and I am going to ask just a kind of general question. Not everyone has to answer it, but I'm just going to put it out there. Someone asked the very interesting question of how you think the use of non-Chinese archival materials will potentially change the shape of the field or change the types of research questions that we're able to ask and answer. So I'm just going to throw that out there, and if anyone wants to take a stab at it, I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, I can jump in on this one. I mean, any of you who have written a historiography essay in graduate school about sort of the state of the field of China since 1949 and focused on books published in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, those books were using sources mostly from outside of China, not in mainland China. And that was the norm. And now we're getting back to that a little bit, it seems like. And so think about what were the shortcomings of those works? What were the strong points of those works? They were good enough to be published and they shaped the field. And now I mean, hopefully the 1980s through 2000s period when it was possible to really do a lot of great archival research inside China. Hopefully that's not the anomaly, right? Hopefully this right now is going to be the anomaly. It's a great topic for a paper, that question, to, you know, what are the patterns? What are the strengths? What I can say about garbological sources is that they are not useful to the state anymore. That's why they were thrown away. So there's a pattern there, right, that we can look at. And if it was useful to keep, it wouldn't have been thrown away. So that's something you can think about. So how did it get out of China? That's one way to start approaching that question, but there's lots of other ways.
So we're just about out of time. I would like to again like to thank our wonderful panelists and Stephanie at the Council on East Asian Studies at Yale for providing the staff support for this event. A video of this webinar will become available on the YouTube page for Yale's Council on East Asian Studies. We'll send a link out with that. We will also send the PowerPoints and some supplementary materials to all registered participants in a follow-up email tomorrow. And finally, just a little plug for the Long Institute, which is a co-sponsor for this event. If you are interested in more webinars like this one, I would encourage you to visit the contact page at the Long Institute website, which I've just put in the chat. Scroll down and you can subscribe to our mailing list. So thank you again for tuning in, and good luck to everyone as we start the new academic year.